So talking about Byron Young, Alabama defensive tackle, flipping the switch here to a different guy, very different build. He's a very, very lean defensive tackle and almost in a way built as like a thick defensive end. And Alabama didn't give him a lot of pass rush opportunities. However, because he played at Alabama, he's asked to play all over the defensive line. Pickens was from a 1 to a 3 at most where he was playing. But here with Byron Young, he's playing all the way out, to a 7. He's bounced around to all these different spots on the defensive line. So for you, Byron Young, what are the things that you liked about him? I was not as excited, but I still understand his value as a prospect. Where do you sit on him?
I think Pickens has a higher floor than Byron Young, but I think Byron Young has a bit more upside than Zach Pickens because so first and foremost, Alabama just traditionally, as far as their defensive tackle play, they always have the guys that can work the point of attack, two gap, do the dirty work, but they don't usually let the shackles loose of guys a ton. I mean, the guy that I always come back to is Jarron Reed, who was a very good player for Alabama, but he was a modest pass rush guy. Like, he didn't have a ton of pass rush production. Then he goes to the Seahawks, I believe, in the second round, and he has a 10-sack season, I believe, in like his second year. And he obviously has shown a lot more pass rush potential than what he showed at Alabama. And that's the player that I see a little bit when I think of Byron Young. I see a little Jarron Reed here because I'm looking at his size profile, 6'2", and I think it was 6'2" and 7/8", so he's 6'3", 299 pounds. He has 33 and 5/8 inch arms, though, so he's got some nice length despite being a little bit of a lighter defensive lineman, sub 300 in the spring. He'll obviously be over 300 when he goes to the Combine or the Senior Bowl or whatever, so he'll be right in that range, but in over 81-inch wingspan as well. So I think the thing that you hit on, Joe, for me, is he is a scheme versatile player, and he is a little bit alignment versatile, right? Like, he can do some stuff in a 0-1, kind of that shade nose type of thing, but he can move out to a 3, to a 4, 4-eye. So he can play in multiple fronts, in my opinion. But I think the thing about me is he has good length. He has a decent power profile. He does pretty well at the point of attack. But the thing that separates him that I think makes him a higher upside player is I think he does have nice explosiveness to him. I think he has nice flexibility to him. Like, I see him as a kid, although he plays mostly in a 2-gap system, that if you get him in a 1-gap style system where you ask him to really penetrate, take offensive linemen to the upfield shoulder, do those types of things, I think that he has some pass rush upside, some pass rush profile, and some penetration profile. So I think in the right system, this could be a player that is a lot better in the NFL than his production showed in college. I think the upside is there. Maybe the floor is not as quite high as a guy like a Zach Pickens, but I think that athletically, there's a lot of tools to work with the Byron Young. I just don't think he's quite far along as far as being a pure penetration player right now.
Right. Byron Young, that was like my main takeaway is he's a lot of projection. He is a lot less than Pickens, where you can get a sense of what his value is going to be. And part of it's the situation that he was in at Alabama, not being asked to do as much as Zach Pickens. Zach Pickens rarely came off the field, but I found myself watching Young, and I'm constantly flipping through plays. I'm like, all right, he's off the field again. They're running their pass rush unit out there with only a 3-down look, so they have to take him off the field. But I agree with you. The flexibility is fantastic. The explosiveness, the linear and lateral quickness, I think is great. It's inconsistent, but it's great. And when you can tap into that, to your point, he could be a way more productive pro than he is a college player, just because he doesn't get as many snaps at the college level. And there's so many different guys that they're able to work with, and they're able to get creative with so many different talented heads. But I am to that point, though. I'm not as bullish on his draft projection because I think that he could be a great player. And again, the ceiling is high. I just felt like watching him, I didn't see much of an impact. Like, I feel like on a play-to-play basis, if his floor is a guy who's just kind of out there and doesn't really do a whole lot, doesn't make a lot of plays, doesn't get any tackles for loss, and also at the same time doesn't really blow up any blocks, like, that's where I'm a bit hung up for Byron Young.
I get that. I do. And it doesn't help with Alabama that they have so many interior defensive linemen who are just like pretty solid football players, right? Yeah. Like DJ Dale is not in the same league as a Byron Young, in my opinion, but he's a solid football player. Tim Smith's a younger guy. I think he's like a sophomore, maybe a junior. That's a solid football player. They have number 92, who I can't pronounce his last name. It's Justin Egg something, who he looks the part. He's like 6'4", 6'5", with long arms, and he plays kind of all over that defensive line. So Byron Young shares a lot of reps with a lot of quality college defensive linemen, and a couple of them will play football at the NFL level, probably not to a high volume perspective, but will play in the next level. So I think it's a tricky evaluation because there is projection. And defensive tackle, and I think this is where you're going with this, Joe, defensive tackle, with how it's kind of forecast today, because there's not a lot of high upside pass rushers in the interior of the game today, right? Because for every Aaron Donald there's a guy like a Jeffrey Simmons who might only get 5 or 6 sacks a season, but he is just a dominant player inside, right? So pass rush upside is not everything. And I think a lot of times that for defensive tackles, you kind of fall more towards wanting the floor than wanting the upside, right? Because that's kind of a lunch pail player, a guy that's going to do the dirty work, a guy that doesn't have to be flashy. Like you can get a Lenville Joseph and an Ndamukong Suh nowadays inside, and you're good to go. Like you don't need to have pass rush upside from those guys. That's not usually where you're generating sacks and a ton of pressures. But I think I think that more people kind of fall to the floor. Like I want the floor at defensive tackle. I don't care as much about the upside, which I think makes it tricky. But I really do think that if he hits his ceiling, Byron Young, I wouldn't be surprised if he a couple seasons has like 7-8 sacks and you're like, oh, nice, like penetration style, maybe double-digit tackle for loss. I just think the upside is very intriguing for me. But I also think that he has the baseline traits of length, some power profile, where he can do the two-gap stuff in times. I just think a penetration-style defense is what really is going to serve him best at the next level.
So after all of that, I sit with him as a third-round pick. Kept it simple. Didn't want to get too wide with the range. I think a third-round pick based on upside, lower floor compared to Pickens. I think that's where I would slot him.
I think that these two players, him versus Pickens, can be a little bit interchangeable in the sense that if I was a system that wanted a little more two-gapping, a little more play at the line of scrimmage, I probably value Zach Pickens slightly higher than a guy like a Byron Young. But if I am a one-gap system that's going to ask penetration style, I think that this is a second-round football player. But for the improper system, then we're talking third, fourth round. But I think for a team that is going to ask for penetration out of their defensive tackles, interior defensive linemen, I think a second-round pick is worth it for a Byron Young, because I think if he hits a ceiling, he's going to be a very good player in the next level, in my opinion.
Yeah, both very explosive prospects, and we're going to continue to move on with our next grouping. I think we've got some edge guys coming up next, and if you missed out on any of the other scouting reports, there's a whole playlist of them on YouTube. They're also in the backlog of audio versions of the show, so make sure you hit that subscribe button if you're listening or you're watching us wherever it might be, at Joe DeLeone, at Rise and Draft. Also, make sure you go to betonline.ag and use promo code BELIEVE, BLEAV, at betonline.ag to get a 50% welcome bonus on your first deposit. Again, BetOnline, best source for all your betting needs. Make sure you head on over there. We'll be back with more, folks. Enjoy the rest of your week.